Okay. That one.
This one is $1,000 bond.
That's it.
Okay, we're gonna call this meeting to order. Chair Moore is absent, so I'll be chairing the meeting tonight. We'll start with the public advisory. The PAB has resumed in-person meetings and encourages community members to attend in person. Community members attending in person should observe the health and safety protocols for in-person meetings of Berkeley boards and commissions as outlined by the city of Berkeley. Land acknowledgement. The city of Berkeley recognizes that the community we live in was built on the territory of Kuchin Utah, ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo, speaking Ohlone people. The ancestors and descendants of the southern Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to all of the Ohlone tribes and descendants of the Verona Band. As we begin our meeting tonight, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants in Berkeley, the documented 5,000-year history of a vibrant community at the West Berkeley Shell Mountain, and the Ohlone people who continue to reside in the East Bay. We recognize that Berkeley residents have and continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this unceded stolen land since the city of Berkeley's incorporation in 1878. As stewards of the laws regulating the city of Berkeley, it is not only vital that we recognize the history of this land, but also recognize that the Ohlone people are present members of the Berkeley and other East Bay communities today. And with that, we will move to item number 2. I said I already did call to order, and we'll go to the approval of the agenda.
Roll call.
Oh, sorry. Okay, roll call. Roll call.
Go ahead and start the roll call. Chair Moore. Absent. Vice Chair Harris.
Here.
Present. Okay. Board Member Calavita.
Here.
Board Member Leftwich.
Here.
Board Member Levine.
Here.
And Board Member Owens.
Here.
We have quorum. Chair Moore is currently absent. On behalf of the ODPA, we have Director Aguilar, Investigator Thomas, and myself, Jose Murillo, the policy analyst. On behalf of the BPD, we have Lieutenant Tate and Sergeant Liddell.
Okay, so we can move to the approval of the agenda.
If I may, we also have the Deputy City Attorney, Iris Mathis, who's joining us remotely.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, so can we now move to the approval of the agenda?
Move we approve.
Their second? Second. Sophie? And next, we will move to public comment. Are there any community members that would like to speak?
So as our general procedure, we'll start with the folks that are physically present here, and then we'll move on to the folks who are attending virtually. With that being said, we'll be allotting 3 minutes. Is there any member of the public who would like to speak?
Hello, my name is Martin Tatum. I live in Berkeley with my family. The city council is scheduled to discuss in closed session on Thursday. And it's about the appointment of permanent police chief. I understand this is not a Q&A, but I have a question, or a series of questions to this board. First is whether this board and the members, the individual members of this board, people in the community,
We can't hear you what you said. Could you speak a little louder? Sorry.
Question number 1. Are the members of this board and the board satisfied with the selection process for our new police chief? Do you believe that the search, selection, interview process have been comprehensive, that an adequate number of candidates have been evaluated, in order to provide the city with the best possible outcome for its future police chief. Question number two is whether you think, as a board and individually, that the proposed, I don't know what's the right word, the proposed new police chief is the right selection for the city. Whether she meets the goals of the city, is and represents the spirit of the reimagining policing as has been discussed in this community since 2020, definitely before, but since July 2020, and bringing to the creation of this board, etc. All this process, to the best of my knowledge, and my knowledge is limited at it, has been very secretive for HR and other reasons. So I have no idea what exactly, these are true questions. I do not know how many people were interviewed. I don't know what was presented in the city council, etc. If I'm ignorant for information that has been available to the public, I apologize. But these are true questions, which I find very concerning. Definitely the idea that the only candidate that is brought forward for approval is somebody from within the system is raises a lot of questions about the search, the process, the qualifications, and so on. Last but not least, I would ask if you don't mind to switch item 8 and 9. I think item 9 of your agenda has, at least by header, some topics that are directly related to the candidate for police chief investigation that it was supposed to be completed before moving forward with the permanent appointment, while item 9 seems to be a more kind of like broad, hour-long item. Thank you for listening.
Is there any additional public comment from those physically present? Okay, seeing and hearing none, we'll proceed to the virtual public comment. Okay, so we have one hand raised virtually. Charles Clark, you have permitted permission to speak. 3 minutes are on the clock.
Good evening and thank you. I am Charles Clark. It's been over 8 months since I last addressed this board and a lot has changed, so let me catch up. Congratulations to Mr. Chairman Moore and Madam Vice Chair Harris on your elections to the leadership of the board. Welcome to Berkeley to Mr. Director Aguiar and to Berkeley City Government to Mr. Analyst Murillo, and welcome back to Madam Investigator Thomas. I would like to be able to congratulate Chief Lewis on her confirmation by the City Council, but there's a council closed session about that this Thursday at 3 p.m., so I'll hold that thought in abeyance. I have 2 main subjects in this public comment. The first concerns the early intervention system that Captain Bolton will be presenting. I think the Berkeley Police Department could benefit from the experience with systems that are in use in other jurisdictions. However, I would caution against this board importing random practices from other places without first thinking very carefully whether those practices would address a problem that Berkeley actually has. For example, Oakland is now in its 20th year of federal court oversight. Has their EIS helped or hurt its compliance with the negotiated settlement agreement? Seattle, Washington has been under a federal consent decree for 11 years. Phoenix, Arizona has been under a US Department of Justice pattern and practice investigation for the past 20 months. And these are all considered success stories in the world of early intervention systems. My advice to this board is, pay attention to the dumb kids in class, but think before you copy from them. My second subject is the 2022 Controlled Equipment Report, starting on page 117 of the packet. I see that the department has complied with several members' requests after last year's report that more cinematic detail be provided about the circumstances precipitating the display or activation of the various classes of controlled equipment. I see three recurring themes in the summaries provided in packet pages 121 through 132. First, mental health cases frequently entail display, but almost never activation of the less than lethal launchers the Berkeley Police Department has. This information may be useful to the specialized care unit as that organization comes online. Second, patrol rifles are displayed but never activated. Recall my memo last year that found the entire Berkeley Police Department has fired a total of 36 bullets in the past 22 years. None of those were rifle rounds. Finally, the variety of weapons that individuals wield around Berkeley is fascinating. There's a sword, a baseball bat, a 5-foot stick, and of course, firearms of all varieties. So my closing advice is, as always, review the police department that Berkeley actually has, to which I would add, consider the threats to public safety that Berkeley actually faces. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any additional member of the public who is attending this meeting virtually who would like to speak? Okay, there are no additional hands.
Okay, so that will take us to agenda item number 4, approval of the minutes.
So I have a change on page 16. Well, actually, A and C. So it says the motion to ask staff to inquire about the next public safety policy committee meeting. I voted yes on that. I wasn't a no. But I did vote no on the second, which is a motion to. Yeah, yes, you just got it. So that's it.
Have something on those notes. On that same page, I have an addition for the end of item 11C, which is also page 16, that has to do with the conflicts of interest subcommittee. And the addition would just be that Chair Moore, Board Member Levine, and Board Member Leftwich are appointed to serve on the subcommittee.
Noted.
Okay. Anyone else?
I move that with those changes that the minutes be approved. Both dates.
Okay, is there a second?
A second.
Okay, and are there any objections to that motion?
Any objections?
It's passed by unanimous consent.
Okay, so we're ready to move to item number 5, ODPA staff report.
Good evening, and Vice Chair and board members, members of the public. I just want to give a few updates on some of the activities this last meeting. Policy Analyst Review and I had the opportunity to travel over to Pittsburgh to an Axon conference, where they were displaying some of their newest technology. We were seeing a new version of the taser and other equipment that they have, their drones, getting more familiar with this technology as they position us better to make these policy reviews and recommendations to the board. So we were able to look at some of that technology there. We are continuing our work with our annual report. I know that we keep reporting on it and we appreciate everyone's patience on it. We want to make sure we get it right. Being the first one and being that we're discussing a transition period from PRC to PAB. The other thing, just a gentle reminder, there's a webinar coming up from April. If you're interested, please let the staff know. The presentation is titled Shielded: How the Police Became Untouchable. It is presented by Joanna Schwartz, a professor of law at UCLA. And another reminder, we have an opportunity before we wrap up this fiscal year to utilize some of our salary savings in a way that we probably won't be able to in future years. So there's the CAPO conference, which is the Canadian Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. There's an opportunity for virtual attendance. Please let me know if you're interested, and we'll go ahead and make those secure those tickets for you. So you can attend. It's in May 29th to May 31st. And they cover a lot of the same topics that NACO would cover. And it just gives us more opportunity to learn about other practitioners' experiences in this field. Those are the quick updates I have. I haven't taken any questions or comments that you may have at this time.
What's the date for the webinar?
It's April 25th.
For the NACO one, correct?
That's for the NACO one, yes.
It's 2 p.m. Eastern time, it's over at 11.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, so that moves us to agenda item number 6, chair and board members' reports. Well, I don't really have a report ready. I'm not sure what Chip had in mind because I wasn't sure he was here, so I have nothing.
Vice Chair.
Yes.
So I thought maybe the public question from the public, I could respond a little bit to. I know we don't have Q&A from the public, but it is an important meeting that's coming this Thursday, and I just wanted to very briefly talk about the role that the PAB has played in that hiring process. I was on a steering committee very, very early on. I played a role in with other community members. I was the only one from the PAB. Played a role in helping to put together a pamphlet to advertise for a new police chief, and I played a very limited role there. We had several meetings, and then there were several candidates. I'm not sure how many, 5, I think, and there were 2 or 3 members of this board. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. That originally helped evaluate those candidates and made recommendations to, I believe, the city manager, who makes the ultimate decision on this. And ultimately, as we know, Chief Lewis was named interim chief. And since then, I don't believe the PAB has played a role. That's what I know. I don't know if anybody has any information they want to add, but that's to my knowledge, we've not been asked our opinion about this for input on this particular appointment coming up.
Yes. Thank you.
May I ask a follow-up question?
I don't know, Vice Chair. I mean, usually we don't go back and forth.
Motion.
Okay, so I guess we need to have a motion to allow for a question.
I'd so.
All right. Fine.
Is there a second?
I'll second. Okay.
This body was established with a purpose, and it's in its name. Even though I was reading the blurb of the role of this body, it doesn't say explicitly selection of a police chief, but I cannot think of a much higher purpose and input that this body could have in driving police accountability of the police. So I guess this is a question for discussion among you, is you're the public, you're the voice of the us, Berkeley, in this. And if this board doesn't feel like the right process took place and the right decision is being put forward, I don't know who would. Where is the voice of the public? And again, I'm not informed. I don't know who were the other candidates. I know little about the interim chief aside from the press, which is not good. And also by, as a footnote, city council apparently said that the confirmation will wait until investigations are resolved in the issue of the bicycle task force, etc. I don't know if those are actual things. But back to the main point. If the police accountability board is not satisfied and in a sense supporting or has voiced dissent to the selection, it's hard for me to understand what higher purpose you would have, this board would have. And this is for discussion amongst you.
Well, I'd like to respond. This board is very concerned about the hiring of the chief. We've made many attempts and have successfully been able to interview part of that process. It's not really a problem with participating. It's a question of whether our recommendations are heard or followed. And I can say I don't think they are very often. In my experience. And so that's frustrating. But I will also add that this issue that's coming up Thursday with the city council took me by surprise. I read about it in Berkeley side. I read about it Friday. It was maybe Thursday's story. But I saw it on Friday, and by that time it was too late to put this matter on our agenda for today. So we have to follow the rules of this process. Something called the Brown Act. The Brown Act was enacted for the public to have a voice, but sometimes the voice is stifled when timelines are followed or notice isn't given. So I don't have an answer about what's going to happen Thursday, but I am concerned about it and I do voice my opinion. So again, we don't always get what we recommend, but we do attempt to make learned recommendations. Excuse my voice. That's all I can say.
Well, thank you, board member, for being. Okay, so I think we can, so I think we can move on to agenda item number 7, the chief of police report.
So the chief asked for me to share her report. She apologizes for not being here to attend herself and deliver this, but she has a number of police related items that are on the city council meeting agenda today. So first is an update to our staffing members. One officer resigned last week, leaving the profession completely. We're working through the hiring process for sworn applicants, dispatchers, and community service officers to support our work in addressing staffing issues. The department worked with Epic Recruiting last week to film updated recruitment materials. This included interviews and footage with the police department's sworn and professional staff with a focus on the mission, vision, and values of the Berkeley Police Department. Also, our internal recruiting team attended 21 recruiting events in March, resulting in over 150 potential officer applicants and over 70 potential dispatcher applicants. Last week, members of the department's Community Services Bureau and Strategic Analysis team supported a council member virtual town hall about public safety. There were over 200 community member attendees, and the team was able to provide information about area data and explain crime trends as well as safety tips for the community. On the 27th of March at 9:15 p.m., this is a case that you might have read about. A suspect followed a victim walking in the South Campus area, tackled her into a parking lot in the 2000 block of Blake, and committed a sexual assault. Forensic evidence was used to identify the suspect, obtain a warrant, and arrest him. On April 6, 2023, the Alameda County District Attorney's Office charged Castellanos Miller with Penal Code Section 209B1, which is felony kidnapping, commit sex crime or robbery, and Penal Code Section 261A2, which is felony sexual assault by means of force or fear, as well as Penal Code Section 228A1, felony assault with attempt to commit a sex crime. On March 21st at 1:20 a.m., a suspect was burglarizing a residence when they were interrupted by the victim. The suspect fled the scene and responding officers established a 2-block perimeter east of the location. Several minutes later, after a brief foot chase, officers safely detained and arrested the suspect. Later, residents nearby located the discarded silver .38 special revolver in the suspect's flight path. Officers obtained surveillance video of the suspect entering the area and used this and other elements from the case to connect the suspect to the firearm. So I'm going to be here tonight as the departmental representative. I'm happy to answer any questions that I'm able to or share anything I can. Also happy to share a message back to the chief or anything to follow up.
Okay, thank you. Well, first, I'd just like to say kudos to you guys for the swift work. That was great to get those suspects in custody so quickly. So if anyone else on the board has? Okay.
Yes, hi, I just wanted to follow up on a request I had made, the chief, 2 meetings ago when she was here, and that was for her to consider appointing someone to be a liaison for the PAB, a contact person, since she's personally still busy. And I had reiterated that request at our last meeting when a representative was here. And so I just wondered, and he said he would pass that request along and see if she had made an appointment or further consideration of that request. So I don't know if you had heard that or have anything to report.
I think that I heard about it. I don't know where we are with it. So I just want to be clear, this is in addition to someone like myself having as a watch commander being here, right?
Right, so for example, if we have a request of the department, or for example, we spoke about it, where I wanted to do a ride along, just there's a contact person, so we're not always having to go to the chief, and this is in between our meetings or after, in follow up after.
I will get you an update.
Thank you.
Lieutenant Tate, thank you for the updates. Just curious with the officer that left, has a exit interview been done, and is there any information you can provide? Does he fit with some of the patterns? Was he a younger officer? Was anything that you can provide so that we can understand a little bit more about this retention issue?
I don't have any information on that, but I will.
And could you just remind me what the staffing numbers are? The actual.
Well, that would have been really good for me to bring.
Okay, we'll get it later.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to follow up on the director's question, because I had the exact same question. Do you generally do exit interviews when people leave?
Yes,
Okay, so you have the information about,
if the individual elects to do the interview. Yes.
oh, I see. Mhm.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Okay, we're moving to the early warning systems training. Captain Bolton. Are we tired?
Thank you, Chair. And hello, everybody. I know I provided a copy of the presentation for ease and streaming online, but I'll start off with an introduction. Please call me Chris, but I'm Chris Bolton. At risk of losing my laptop. Chris Bolton, I did recently retire from the Oklahoma Police Department as a Deputy Chief of Police. Retired with 23 years. And within my time in the police department, I was fortunate enough to not only lead 3/5 of Oakland's jurisdiction for 24/7 police response, but fortunate enough to lead the men and women of the police department, over 200 of them in doing so. When I retired, I retained the passion that I had learned from several positions within the police department, one being the department's inspector general at a point, served time as the the internal affairs division commander in various assignments and ranks, and various chiefs of staff, or to be honest, too many chiefs of police. But I developed a passion for being armed with data, making better, more effective, more efficient decisions, and trying to cause a more data-informed decision-making process, as well as decision-making culture from the use of data. And was just as important to me in providing service to the community as it was to be a better leader for the men and women who follow me. I currently, you can go to the next slide, please. I currently am an independent consultant. My company is Field-Based Consulting, LLC. I also subcontract with several companies, one of them being Slalom Incorporated. I assist as a thought leader and strategic advisor and consultant with their justice and public safety team. They are internationally known as being able to come in and helping municipalities, law enforcement agencies, correctional facilities, anywhere in the criminal justice and public safety space, understand the power of data and better utilize data. With Polis Solutions, I am a lead subject matter expert for data. I'm most excited to work with them on new and upcoming ways that body-worn camera video can be used, automatically assessed through natural language processing, as well as multimodal computer vision, what the cameras are actually picking up on. I think that there are, interestingly enough, to tonight's conversation, some overlap with how the future can hold body-worn camera footage with early warning or early intervention systems. And then lastly, with I'll mention the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. There's a little overlap there because it was NICJR before I was involved with them, who worked with Berkeley's reimagining policing task force or efforts, and they had actually in their report made a recommendation that the city of Berkeley, I think, at least entertained the idea of gaining the value of an early intervention system. So I'm now working with them as well. Thank you for the opportunity. The scope of tonight was to provide an overview training, not to recommend what to do or how to do it, but an overview of early intervention systems. And I appreciate the director's opportunity. The director has supported me and really appreciate meeting you all. Next slide, please. So in line with the expectations and the training that I discussed, that I just summarized, I do have room and time at the end of the presentation for questions, but if there's something that's really bubbling up at the top and you feel that it's relevant and it's, maybe not the best question ever, but like top 10 questions are the best questions ever, feel free and we can go off track a little bit even. But the basic lesson plan is to go over uses and benefits, best and common practices, and I did a little research on how early warning, early intervention systems, police performance management systems can and have been used by civilian oversight boards. Next slide. So the ideal purpose of an early intervention system, and I'll cover this now, because I think it might be on the next slide or the last slide, but you'll hear, if you read your research, you'll find a couple different definitions or names for the system itself. When these systems first popped up in the 1970s, 1980s, and began to gain some traction, they were called early warning system. Right now, if you find something written in the last probably 3 to 5 years, it's going to be early intervention system. It's really the same system, but it is an important distinction because the reason that intervention has really been highlighted for use is that these are systems meant to be preventative in nature and beneficial for officers and law enforcement officers' careers. They are not punitive, they are not gotcha systems. They are to make the best use of data and make decisions to be beneficial to policing and the policing services that those officers provide. It is not designed to detect poor behavior. I think I'll say it here in one of the slides that come, that there's no such thing, this is my thing, right? There's no such thing as good data or bad data. The value is how you assess the data, what meaning, what direction can the data point you to? And that is also exemplifying the value of having supervisor and command input in that review process. Because data in and of itself can be very misleading. It can look black and white, but in reality, it can point you just really in a general direction. And that quality review with superior supervision and command leadership can really decide what direction to go in as opposed to the system itself. Next slide, please. And by the way, I have, I'm not going to read slide by slide. Feel free to read in the packet. I've done probably a poor job. My old professors would probably be embarrassed. I've done a really poor job of referencing things out of order and probably not in any sort of similar format. But the last couple of pages do contain a lot of references that I found useful. And there are a couple in there that I would recommend that you read if you have the ability and time to do so. So you're here. And so again, this is just really stressing the point that the goal of an early intervention system is in helping an employee reach their full potential by using the data to identify performance outputs. It's intended to be a tool to enhance supervision. It's not a replacement for supervision itself. In fact, I would argue that with data and with better access to data, supervision, that component of supervision and supervisors making decisions are even more important. Next slide, please. This is just a mock-up of just, a pretend police department to give you an overview on how systems work. So in their simplest form, early intervention systems will track certain events like use of force, lawsuits, complaints are obviously on there. Agencies of various sizes, various locations will choose the types of events they track. There is no one suggested model, best practice, evidence tested and based way to design a system when you're deciding what data to put into it. However, the more data you feel is accurate, relevant, and timely, and can be useful to point leadership as well as the men and women in an agency should be in some way, shape, or form fed into a centralized repository of data. And that's what this represents here. There's some acronyms in there, but law enforcement and agencies are unfortunately at a disadvantage. They're probably anywhere from 10 to 20 years behind the private sector. Data is highly siloed, meaning you have a lot of data in one system that doesn't necessarily communicate, or it overlaps, or at worst, it provides a different definition for a data source as another system. And that's a huge hurdle to tackle, or I guess you would jump a hurdle. Tackle the challenge. We'll go and jump that hurdle. And that would be one of the points that an agency would want to consider. How siloed are these systems of data? What data is reliable? What data is understood? Chair Harris and I were talking before that we've had numerous conversations in the past about, wow, we really wish computer-aided dispatch CAD had this type of data. Or it's saying this, but we know that a human doesn't enter this in the way that the system captures it. So maybe response times aren't that reliable. That's unfortunate, really, when one of our core missions in law enforcement is to build community trust and confidence, and the systems we're using aren't very reliable. RMS is records management system, and then the arrows, obviously, everything, these systems will feed different buckets or categories of information. So you might get your force information from a use of force database, or there's various, it might be IA Pro for investigation data, or you might have a home-based access database, and some departments have embarrassingly Oakland did for some time. But the important part is the ability to recognize what kind of data you have access to, what data you feel is valid and relevant to achieve your mission, what you're trying to do, and then how can you structure data to feed into a central repository. Next slide, please. So I already covered that the choice is, there's no one size fits all agencies. The choice of what systems to access and how to do that it is up to individual departments. There's a tailored range of performance data that is found. The caller, I think it was Mr. Clark, had a great opening to this in that Phoenix's system is different than Seattle, but Seattle's system is different from Oakland, and there is no one size fit all. There is no one that is known to work for any one agency. There's a high degree of customization, and that is good because everything is unique, and you want a customized solution to further your goals, your objectives, and your visions. Some examples on that in terms of range. Early intervention systems are a requirement of CALIA certified agencies. CALIA is the accreditation for law enforcement, something accreditation, Commission for Law Enforcement Accreditation, I think. So they certify agencies of different sizes and different scopes of missions and different scope of work. They don't say what type of system to adopt, only that it achieves the point of an early intervention system. And then on the grander scale, we had earlier this year an executive order, presidential executive order, directing all federal law enforcement agencies to have, there's some due date, but to have an early intervention center system for all federal agencies. So you're dealing with FBI that might have somewhere between 13 and 15,000 federal agents to, a small department in, Minnesota who is seeking CALIA accreditation. They're all going to be able to put together a useful system. North Carolina is another interesting example where they passed a state law requiring all North Carolina law enforcement agencies to have a system. That system can range from literally an Excel spreadsheet where someone is, again, identifying accurate, relevant data, putting it on paper, and then being able to use that in charts and graphs and however, to extremely, maybe more complex and complicated systems. Next slide, please. This is just an example from two different national sources on the types of data that could be considered for use in an early intervention system. Some agencies might not have this data. Some agencies may want to put it on their strategic plan to seek to be able to provide this type of data and make decisions because of it. But knowing what type of data you have access to, what data is going to be helpful, is one of the first steps in deciding what type of system to implement. Next slide, please. And not only is it the figuring out what silos exist for your public safety data and understanding the metadata in those individual systems, or even one complaint record. So it's not just complaints. Because feeding complaints into a central repository may sound relatively easy, but the fact of the matter is that within a complaint record, you could have just spitballing easily 50 pieces of data within one complaint record. Is that complaint system and that complaint record going to be able to give you the type of classification of the complaint, whether it's internally or externally generated? What allegation was alleged? Does that allegation fall in sort of a bucket of allegations? What type of personnel information are you associated with the complaint record? Is it showing you where Officer Bolton, who received a complaint, was working at the time of the complaint, or is it going to show you where Officer Bolton is working today? It's rather a complex exercise to understand what type of data exists and exactly what you're going to prioritize to bring over. The other examples is stock data. I know Berkeley is compliant with, AB 953 and the state law that was passed through the Racial Identity and Profiling Act. But even within, one stop, there are numerous types of, I'm calling them metadata. Someone's probably going to say that that's not what it is, but I'm using it. A lot of different pieces of data associated with just one stop record. And to give you a glimpse of the value of that, you may find that an early intervention system may want to, one agency may want to just track stops, the number of stops made and where stops are. I'm just making things up. Another agency may choose that on top of what are the race, ethnicity, genders associated with those stops, building a dashboard or at least the ability to evaluate racial disparities and on what type of stops that are occurring. Are there searches highly associated with those? What is the quality of recovery, if any? And this is a long-winded way of getting to where we need to get to, and that's how a system can evaluate all of this data once it gets fed in. So your next slide. And that is flagging mechanisms. And this is going to be a very brief overview. You would really want a data scientist or someone to really explain how these algorithms and thresholds work out. Again, there is a best practice, and I'll get to that, but there's no standard way of doing this. Again, it's highly dependent on the agency, on the type of data that it's producing, and the whole purpose of using that data. But here we have some examples of different, I'm calling them flagging mechanisms or flags. Once you have all this data feeding into a system, how is the system going to make use of it? That's later. So thresholds are simply flags for data when there's some sort of objectively defined count of a certain event within a prescribed period. And so, for example, I have here 3 complaints within 180 days. And the reason why I say that has to be made up is that for a large agency with a policy of taking a lot of complaints and mandated to take a lot of certain type of complaints, they're going to have a higher level of complaint taking per officer, right? So it'd be a mistake to take, Smith PD in whatever state in the United States has this threshold, and we think that, they reported that works for them. You can't take that, mirror it, and transplant it to another agency that has a different complaint policy that creates a different type of complaint culture and a different type of threshold, or at least a peer comparison to peers. If you're looking at peers as an officer in that other state compared to an officer in your state. An outlier is simply a flag for officer activity that it demonstrates an unusual number of certain events compared to other officers. Again, that's highly simplified. You would also want to make sure that if you're using these peer-to-peer comparisons, that you're using the right definition of a peer. I'm not sure what Berkeley has first and second, third watches and whatnot, but you'll have highly different officer activity on an officer working a day watch shift in the daytime compared to an officer that works on an evening shift. So it would be a mistake to use them as peers. It would be maybe make more sense of using in an agency using a daytime shift compared to other daytime shifts. There's also a distinction of different types of officers. So if you've chosen to use data of a squad, Squad X, and Squad X has 9 officers, right, that are sworn to uphold and protect that community on their given shift, it may be that not all 9 officers are exactly right. Within your 9 officers, you might have a canine officer who's going to be providing a lot of different use of force data, for instance. You might have a designated patrol rifle officer who may bring a whole different level of force, or at least a different different reasoning and intent for using force compared to their peers on the same shift, even if that makes sense. And here's where I pause and I said there's no best practice, because the best practice right now is with machine learning algorithms. That is not having it. I'll say this: if you're going to have what the evidence and the writing and the academic studies say is that if you're going to have a peer-to-peer threshold, you're going to have outliers. And you're going to use, some objectively defined methodology of identifying officers, that's fine if that's within your abilities and that's what you want to do. However, keep it highly flexible. Keep it so that the system can be adapted and changed as leadership or even as this body recognizes patterns or trends that maybe the first iteration of those methodologies didn't pick up on. So keep it flexible, keep the ability to change those methodologies in the future. The best evidence right now, if you're looking for evidence-based early warning, early intervention systems, are machine learned algorithms. And that's, again, a data scientist would probably look at this and say he doesn't, he didn't do it justice, so I apologize. But from my man on the street view of how these work is it uses a form of regression. So let's say it's obviously 2023. Let's go back with the same relevant, mostly the same policy, the same procedures, the same staffing. Let's go back in time and let's look at instances where misconduct arose in 2018. And then let's look at the performance data from 2016 to end of 2017. Through that algorithm, it can learn what types of things were associated. Again, not bad things that happened in the previous years before the misconduct, but what things are most highly associated in terms of trends and patterns or combinations of pieces of data that may have been able to predict that misconduct. And right now, I don't think I put it on the slide, but if you compare a objectively based measured system, you're getting false positives. And I apologize if I went a slide. Did anybody see a slide that said false positives or false negatives? Maybe I haven't gotten there. A false positive is going to flag an officer where eventually there was no need to flag that officer. And that should be avoided for a couple different reasons, right? Or if you want to get as relevant and as predictive and beneficial system as possible, because at 8%, which is some of the literature says at 8% accuracy, what you can do is create more work for supervisors that end up reviewing for instances where there was no misconduct, there's no pattern or trend that would indicate potential misconduct. And I have a couple examples here later on. And you have also perceived burnout from being flagged by a system. So you could have officers who start off by being extremely invested and passionate about doing the right thing for the right reason at the right time for the neighborhood that they serve, but knowing that, well, officer so-and-so and officer so-and-so just got flagged for this type of behavior, so I'm going to avoid that type of behavior itself. If that sort of culture, that sort of use in the system begins to develop, you're not adding to public safety, you're actually detracting people from doing a job in a way that may have otherwise been beneficial. And again, that's why I say there's no such thing as bad or good data, there's only good supervision and good command leadership that indicates what you are doing, Officer Bolton, is in line with the vision and values and mission of my police department. Okay, and so the last is supervision, supervisor discretion. I'll just use Oakland as an example. We had objectively based thresholds and peer-to-peer comparisons. Over time, those became less and less relevant. Which is probably another lesson about having a system that's flexible enough and having the ability to change those types of measurements, because the objective measurements became less and less relevant. However, we saw the benefit of bringing supervisors and commanders in. This is the intent of early warning. It's to support officers in their career. It's to help them be better officers. And so supervisors became more in tune than the system in identifying officers for different types of dispositions that we'll go over here in a second. Next slide, please. Already talked about peer-to-peer, ratio is just a comparison to each other, yes, so we're good. And so here are a few of the best practices and dispositions. What I mean by disposition is, once you have an early intervention system up and operating, you have the data feeding into the centralized repository, you have either machine learned or objective measurements there. You've decided how you want to measure performance, you've decided how you want to flag performance. And a necessary component to that is supervisor review. And I say supervisor, it could be commander, it depends on the agency and how their organization is structured. But you want human eyes on that data. You want some inspection and research in what is causing that data, what's behind the data, what was the result of that data, and ultimately was the outputs, the data outputs that were being produced through the performance of that officer, were they in line with expectations of policy and procedure? If the answer is yes, then you actually need to look at the issue as at a higher level, because maybe it's the expectations, maybe it's the policy, maybe it's the training that can be improved that caused that sort of negative or potentially negative piece of data to be output from the system. Flexibility adjustment, already covered that. We can move on. And okay, so I mentioned disposition. So once you have that supervisor review, you now have some decisions to make. A system is recommended that no matter what type of data you're assessing, no matter what level of supervisor you're having to research that flagged data, that you have some way of documenting the review, what was examined, what were the findings, and I would say depending on maybe the size of the agency, again, there's no right or wrong way, but you want some assurance that that review is quality. So you can do that, through quality control somehow, or an inspection of some sort. But also, eventually, that supervisor is going to have to make a decision within the system based on the system's data, and that could be from no action, I evaluated it, no issues here whatsoever, monitoring or intervention. Monitoring is, I don't think that there's an issue here, at least I'm not led to believe there's an issue, but I'm going to keep an eye on it, and I'm going to maybe inspect this couple of things in the next couple of weeks or the next couple of months. That could be a documented process. It could be an informal process. That's going to depend on the policy that is passed along with the early intervention system adoption. Intervention is a more formal plan. An intervention would be the disposition if an officer Bolton was flagged in the system, the supervisor has read through the data outputs, have looked a little bit, maybe at using body-worn camera footage, read some crime reports, looked at some complaint packets, and we've seen a pattern. And I'll use myself example as a young officer. I had too many vehicle collisions. It seemed to be that whenever I was reversing a police car, fire hydrants and poles magically moved in my way. I will maintain that is the case to this day, but I had too many issues. So what are the intervention for that wouldn't hopefully be as simple as, well, hold and stop hitting things. Yeah, I understand that, but what was the real cause? Was it multitasking? Was it, I'm too focused on doing this while I'm doing that? Maybe I need some mentorship. Maybe I need some extra driving training. Maybe I need to tie a piece of red tape on my shifter and actually get outside of my car and look behind me, which is what I ended up doing for a while. But an intervention comes with, sort of an improvement plan. This is what we think is the issue that's causing some negative performance. Let's help you not do this anymore, because it's stressful for you as an officer. It's not what the community wants to see. And ultimately, we want you here for a long time. And this is what we think is going to help improve. Now, again, an overuse of intervention and overuse of monitoring is going to make people not produce the data to land into what I say is a beneficial place of being helped by your supervisor. At the end of the day, I don't care what job you have. If I came in and I would tell this officer, I realize, right, if your boss comes into your office and says, great news, I'm gonna be paying extra attention to what you're doing for, the next 6 months, or the next 3 months. None of us are really elated by the prospect of that extra layer of supervision, but if it's done in the right way, you understand that it's being done from a good place for a good reason, good intent by and from your supervisor. Already discussed the need to document and the review for supervisors. They're good. We're moving along. The long quote there is a reference that's from a really good report that I found. And that said that there's really 2 factors that a good EIS system is dependent on: the data accuracy of the system and how the agency acts on the results of that prediction. That's why I focus so much on that supervisor involvement. But I really think that I expanded that to 4. Because at the end of the day, it's got to be reliant on accurate, timely data that you trust is going to point you in the right direction when you're making a decision about someone's performance. And then, of course, the predictive accuracy of the system, I agree with that, but it's also the use of the system. I've touched a little bit about that. If you don't have policy, if you don't have training, if you don't establish early on a good culture that here's a system, police department X, that is designed to benefit you. If you don't pull in the police department from, agency X, and view them as partners in developing the system and understanding the data, and understanding where they want to go in terms of reform and progress, you're not going to get a well-used system. People are reluctant to use things that are crammed down our throats, right? And it's much more better for a data informed culture to be viewed as a partner and a collaborative. Yes.
So you say it's important that it's timely, and so I'm wondering, is this something that is done on an ongoing basis? Is the data evaluated quarterly, monthly? I mean, what's the timing on all?
So it depends. It's highly dependent on the system that's built. In the more complex, and I don't mean complex in a negative term, but the bigger systems that are normally associated with consent decrees or settlement agreements, the data is normally constantly being fed and constantly being run. So the flags, those peer-to-peer comparison or the ratios or the thresholds, they are always running in the background. And so you will get a flag that's automated on whatever methodology, on whatever, whatever code is in that system. It's going to spit out something that morning or that afternoon, and that starts the process of review. And then it's also highly dependent on policy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the benefits of embedding an early intervention system into an overall performance management system, because ideally, I think, and this is just the opinion of Chris Bolton, I want to put eyes on, depending on how large my unit is or my bureau or division or whatever you call it, at least on a monthly basis, I want to put eyes on the patterns and trends. What are the outcomes? What are the results of, and are those results consistent with my expectations? And if not, is the problem with me, or is the problem at the supervisor level, or is there a potential problem at the officer level? Oakland has quarterly risk management meetings, and most consent decrees actually outline the mandated time of inspection, I guess. But it's highly dependent on what the department should find useful, is what I would err to. So use of the system, great question, thank you. I will put that in the top 10 of best questions ever, so you're excused for asking. And then the effectiveness of response. If you don't have that quality level of review, if you're making poor decisions on either end of the spectrum, I don't see a problem here, and there's really a problem, that officer is not being best served. Or there's really no problem, but I'm, I've made a decision to place an officer in intervention based on what the data was showing, not necessarily on the intent or the result of that data. That could result in misuse as well. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. So here are the key benefits. I've touched a little bit. Oh, the highly accountable learning organization, which is a term that I pulled from that National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform in their report. to the city of Berkeley. And that's really just saying that such a system helps leaders develop a culture where people feel supported, wellness is prioritized, and we're looking at attrition, keeping the right people for the right reasons, and keeping them happy for as long as possible. Education and training, mentoring, health and wellness, that's really the point of this. Again, it's not disciplinary. There's no magic 8-ball that's going to, you feed all this data and it says, Chris Bolton is your problem, discipline him immediately. There's not a system that does that, nor should a system do that. The proactiveness and being more data informed, in my opinion, creates better relationship, better transparency, better accountability for the community that agencies serve. It's too often that I, as a police leader, didn't have access to the best data, didn't know what data was being produced, and it wasn't uncommon for people in the community to have better ways of manipulating data and viewing data than I had, and that shouldn't be the case. If agencies are able to demonstrate that, look, we have the same values. Was that?
Around it.
Did I say Siri or Alexa or something?
Help me see.
We'll continue on. Okay, so patterns and trends may indicate where that leader support is also needed. And again, data outputs could indicate where performance is needed to be addressed at an individual level, but it could also indicate when policy or training needs to be adjusted as well. Next slide. Oh, the last one was probably the more important. If you read the studies, they tend to beneficially help with preventing adverse incidents, such as namely use of support and complaints. However, next slide is, I think, titled, however, reviews of systems are generally positive, but if you're looking for evidence-based, this will cause this to happen. I think really more research is needed. I came away with reading and from my own experience that just having such a system, having access to the system made me a better supervisor, made me a better leader, made accountability more of a reality, that was more of a benefit than it was having a threshold or a peer-to-peer comparison. Just having that ability to know that I'm looking at reliable, relevant data. They may be effective in reducing those sustained misconduct and use of force, but there's really no direct causal relationship. I talked about the false negatives and false positives. There's a huge jump with the machine learning algorithms that has been reported out. I think the University of Chicago has a paper that's referenced, and there was another system that was also machine learning based. There's also consequence of system bias. So understanding that all departments are unique, policies, cultures are different, practices are different. If you have something, a practice or a policy that is giving you disparate results in terms of gender or race, and I'm talking about the officer level, if that exists within the data, and now you're asking a system to evaluate that same data, it's going to replicate the bias of the data going into the system. So that's one of the caveats and sort of, yellow if not red flags to kind of do that dig deep inventory of what data are you really looking at and how can that data be abused. Next slide. I'm not going to go over these, but that's in your packet. These are best practices from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. I think it was relatively recent, in 2019 or 2020, and it was one of the most helpful preliminary overviews of EIS adoption that I found. Next slide, please. And then also same thing for Council on Criminal Justice. They had a task force of policing. They produced a couple different reports within the last couple of years. That's also referenced in your packet. They had, again, they echoed that statistical prediction model, or I was calling it machine learning. And they have some other tips and tricks that they learned from a rather wide range of evaluation. Next slide, please. Performance management, I've sort of touched here and there on it, but performance management ideally would be something that a department can do with or without an early intervention system. We're talking about the same types of data repositories and the same abilities to take data and use it and examine it, filter it, play with it, question it. And at the end of the day, it's, in my opinion, to help hold leadership accountable more so than the men and women working in that agency accountable. Is what we're producing a result of our expectations? And if not, is there a problem with the way we're communicating? Is there a problem with training? Is there a problem with policies? At the end of the day, a leader has no disagreement with a community member or no disagreement with an association head. We all want to deliver service in the best way possible and in a way that demonstrates the courage, the professionalism, the ethics of law enforcement personnel in those neighborhoods. Data and making those data informed decisions is quite a way to do that. Next slide, please. How am I doing on time? I didn't start a timer or anything.
40 minutes.
Okay, great. This is a little exercise I put in here. If I had time, I'll spend a little bit of time, but and I don't know how well you can see it from the back, or if you want to go on to the packet and look at it with a little bit more detail. In fact, I need glasses to so again, there's no such thing as good or bad data. There's only good assessment of the data with the appropriate outcome and decision. So in this example, we have a very basic look at just an example police department, their patrol division, and this I just made up that they have 3 shifts and a community policing unit, right? So you see in the columns, you have watch 1, watch 2, watch 3, and then your community policing unit in that last column. We have data shown for the number of complaints, we have uses of force as total, and we have a number of stops conducted by each of those units. So if you're just looking at this at a glance, and you compare the community policing unit to others, the community policing unit has a far higher complaint ratio with much fewer stops. That's kind of what jumps out at you. And so you might automatically want to say, aha, well, that's a problem squad, or potentially there could be just one officer within a whole squad that has caused each of those complaints, right? But that's where your focus may be drawn to. However, there's no such thing as good or bad data. The value is in the ability to question, to tease out what is it and why is it that I'm seeing that pattern of data. Is the data, again, falling in line with my expectations? So are the community policing unit complaints from one search warrant alleging a unlawful search, where they were armed with a search warrant, but that's the allegation each officer on that operation was involved in, and everybody gets a complaint of an unlawful search. Depending on how you've chosen that data, chosen to take that data over into the early intervention system, you could be looking at one incident in which a bunch of different officers were involved, and it's looking like 10 complaints, but it's really one incident. And again, when you look into the deeper understanding and meaning of that incident, you understand that the probable cause was well articulated. There's no issue with that search at all. Now, if that's the only allegation, as a supervisor, you may say, well, that's why that flag was thrown for that squad, or that's why that flag was thrown for these officers. Similarly, a little bit on the stop. So you have officers working on a special operation, they serve a search warrant, where their stop is the stop ratio compared to complaints, which could be a threshold within that system, where the stop so low because they were working on a special operation, developing a search warrant. So they were intelligence based, they were surveillance based as opposed to being out on the street. That's not going to be an accurate comparison, for that CPU unit compared to a patrol unit. And it's not going to be an accurate comparison in that time frame compared to, right? So you can see how it's all in the details. The key is to understanding why the data is telling you to look at it, and then doing a really good job of questioning the data at the end of the day, making sure that it's within expectations. I think that's it, unless somebody has a question. I think I also said that there was differences in the type of officer, right? So in that, you could have let's say in watch 2, they had 5 complaints, or in watch 3, they have a handful of use of force. It could be that there's one officer who has data for that squad showing up in an early intervention system. It's doing a peer-to-peer comparison for squad 1 to squad 3. But when the supervisor looks at it, that officer has worked a significant more amount of overtime or special assignments or volunteering in a different capacity that has caused their performance to be different and therefore their performance data to be different. So long story short, there's no such thing as good or bad data. It's not a magic 8-ball. It's a way for supervisors, leaders to be pointed in the right direction and then make the best decision in the interest of their officers and their community. Next slide, please. And we'll go to case uses for oversight bodies. The best resource I found was NAPOL's Civilian Oversight Agency Directory, which was a great find. I don't know if anybody's played with that before, or you knew about it. So I haven't. So it's publicly available. I was able to go in there. And again, with the dashboard and the ability to filter different things, I was interested, okay, NAPOL, show me all the police oversight agencies or bodies that have some awareness or some involvement or some access to early intervention system data. And it popped up, next slide, 28 agencies listed with access to early intervention system records. And then I was able to actually filter more because it was interesting, has to go down. I was wondering, well, because they had a filter on access to stop data records as well, separate and apart from early intervention. I personally want stop data records in an early intervention system. And so it turned out that when I filtered that, 25 of the 28 agencies also had access to stop data as well. Next slide is, I think, going to go over some, we've got 2 slides of all the different agencies. 2 of them are nearby. BART and Oklahoma Police Commission. And then next slide, we'll get into where we're going, which is there's really 4 different ways that I found civilian oversight bodies can have involvement in early intervention system. The first is just to simply be a part of the recommendation and the partnership and the collaboration and the development of an early intervention system. Second is to actually collaborate with the implementation. I imagine there's also policy issues involved in that. How often is the data reviewed? Is it monthly or quarterly? But again, partnering with the police leadership and developing that. And I forget, the reference is there. So this is from Citizen Review of Police Approaches and Implementation from USDFA, that's the program. NIJ, long sentence there, but they also include that oversight bodies, civilian oversight bodies can operate the EWS for the department. I was not able to find an example of that in existence. It may very well be out there, but my Google is beyond my Google search abilities. But they did list that as a possibility. And then also, and I imagine this is more closely to how Oakland was using it, is their Office of Inspector General having access to audit the department system, the use, the outcomes. Part of that also, the collaboration, it may just be as simple as asking for a report. There's a policy in that agency that requires monthly or quarterly meetings to evaluate pattern trends. There's statistics that come out of that, how many people are monitoring, how many people are in intervention, were those dispositions successfully carried out. Those might be things that a civilian oversight agency could collaborate in the form of asking for reports and then having input on those reports. Next slide. And I already went over to it, but there's an example, a very basic EIS directive, and that would be applicable to a very small agency, but not a very robust system, but a department that needs an early intervention system in order to become accredited. Next slide is we're done. time for questions, comments, concerns. I realized that was very fast. I was a little concerned with getting all the way through it for time, enough for questions. It's a very basic overview. And, you know, if I had to just put a takeaway in there is that they are beneficial. The reading, literature, the studies show that they are beneficial. It's not a magic 8 ball. There's no magic way of predicting what to do and when to do it and why to do it. It's highly dependent on what the agency or what the municipality wants to achieve, what type of system they build. Highly dependent on resources, on policy, on training, and funding. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for that. I didn't understand the NACO directory slide. You talked about 25 agencies had access to stop data. I didn't understand if there was 28, those 25 agencies.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so, yeah, good question. So 28 agencies reported that they have access to early intervention system data. And then knowing that there's no one recommended way to design an early intervention system in terms of what data the system is going to be pulling in. Stop data in this day and age is absolutely vital in my opinion.
So there are only 28 agencies across the country who have
That report that have oversight bodies and also filled out a survey for Nicole that they then input in there. So it may be 28, but maybe that they only got a 30% response there. That help? And then the 25 comes in because 25 of the 28 also reported that they have a similar access to stop data records. I will add that that's another, not a hurdle, but it's something to consider that, you know, obviously access to different types of records, we're dealing with personnel information. So access to different types of records is going to be highly dependent on the city attorney's review, on you know, potentially meet and confer, or at least, you know, meet and discuss on what type of data is being shared with whom, how, why. You know, again, there's no one best practice. You know, at the end of the day, I would like to think that it's the partnership and collaboration that are most important in developing any kind of a system, and that, you know, everyone does their best to make usefulness out of it. Hopefully that helps. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
So I would assume that if an agency is beginning one of these systems, or just, you know, starting out, that it would make officers a little nervous, and that it would be nice to provide training and try to provide reassurance and use some of the terms that some of the discussion that you had about this is to be proactive and to help people and not to be punitive. So would you agree with that, that you need to train? Is there training for officers on how the system works and how the data, so that they understand it?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And the ability to adopt and see it as value and use it as a value is probably one a highly dependent variable will be the amount of internal procedural justice and how comfortable officers feel working in the organization. I can imagine some organizations where they would say, hey, no problem, this makes sense, right? And there's other agencies that have, unfortunately, a degree of distrust and mistrust, some valid, maybe some not, but that's going to be a variable for sure. You know, interestingly, there are small things that, you know, employees will pick up on that can also indicate support or lack of support. So I'll use Oakland as an example. The first iteration of EIS, going back to probably the early 2000s, was a system pretty basic in design and nature, and it would show, I think, you know, bureau statistics, and then you could filter down and look at, you know, a watch, and then you can filter down further and see squads, and then eventually you could see officer bulletin on. Well, if performance data was being flagged or was being close to being flagged, there was a color code scheme that went along with that. Green, yellow, red.
Oh, my.
What does it mean to Officer Bolton if I see my name on the, what's it called, police and PIM, police improvement management system or something. What is Officer Bolton taking away when I see my hard work, the work that I think I'm doing great on, and my performance data is red? My supervisor is sitting down with me because I am, quote, in the red, which is still used today. I don't want to get in the red. That's not the type of culture we need to build. This is what I need you to do. This is why it's important. This is a great way to do it. I'm going to give you the tools, the training, the support to do it. And if there's outcomes that are unfortunate and you're going by my expectations, my direction, I'm going to be in front of the community meeting and explaining the data, not you. Because the data is consistent with my expectations.
And it just seems that that's something that should be, taught in the academies so that officers are aware coming in at the early stage. That is something that is there to help them be better officers versus, after they've been there for a few years and now all of a sudden, no, I'm getting called into the office for, this review. It can be looked at as a negative thing.
Yeah.
And I think in Oakland, it was the case. We were in the settlement. Started.
Yeah. An example, I don't have to be as careful anymore, but it's an example of things being forced down your throat and being a little bit reluctant to adopt things. I'll also say that it's an opportunity for not only for supervisors and commanders to demonstrate support, but it should be an ability for agencies to advocate for resources and tools, referrals, programs. Because if Officer Bolton, I use myself as an example of getting into car wrecks, maybe Officer Bolton has a substance abuse problem, and that is distracting from my sleep, where I have marital problems, and that has changed my behavior and how I interact with people. It should be an opportunity to advocate. This police department has officers who are suffering from these incidents and this type of stress. We need to provide adequate referral resources and programs, not as punitive measures, but as, remember, we had the intervention strategies, but as an intervention strategy designed, we want you to. And speaking as an officer who went to substance abuse recovery and was having those issues and able to not only complete my career, but complete it at such a high level, I was extremely thankful for the support of my leadership during some difficult. Yes, Director.
Yes, back to the slide about the flagging mechanisms. Most of them were relatively objective, like the threshold, the outlier, machine learning, but then there was the subjective, the supervisor's discretion.
Right.
What potential is there and what safeguards are there to protect from abuse of a supervisor that they may be out to get a patrol officer? Have you seen that? And I guess what kind of mechanism could be built into the system so a supervisor's discretion is not abused?
So the supervisor discretion, well, I'll use what I'm familiar with. So in Oakland, supervisor discretion to review an officer is different than a decision to start an intervention or a monitoring strategy. Oakland has sort of a complicated system where there's a fairly independent body that reviews cases and either agrees or disagrees with decisions. So that is sort of a stopgap. I'm not suggesting that that's a best practice. I'm just saying that now that I think about it, that could be an effective stopgap. That I am positive that sort of being harassed or picked on using data is certainly something that has been alleged. And again, in Oakland, it would not only be the supervisor's discretion, but it would also require at least actually two, potentially 3 levels of review above us. So as a deputy chief, I was reviewing performance plans that were based on monitoring or intervention. And to say the obvious, if a leader or another supervisor who's involved in that process, they should have the ability and the courage to say, I don't agree with you, Sergeant Bolton, that this is probably the wrong path to take for this reason, and we hash it out. Yes, ma'am.
I had a question. It kind of sounds like the systems you're describing, may pertain to the whole police department. But, are there times when an early intervention system is only looking at a certain number of officers every year? Like, is there a number? Is it 10%, 5%, 20%?
You can find some studies that say that a threshold system would predict, maybe I'm taking a stab at what I remember from the reading, 10 to 20% of officers. But again, there's no one size fits all. I think it's highly dependent on the data. It's highly dependent on the threshold set. And it's another important reason for wanting that flexibility and the ability to change it. Because if I have an agency that has 50 officers and it's flagging 40 for review, then it's probably not, it's causing me more work, right? Then maybe it's worth it. Or you really have, your expectations are really not meeting what the data outputs. And I would say that that's more of an indication of leadership policy training than it is about individual officer performance. That's the danger in those false positives and false negative numbers. If you have a system that's spitting out too many people to be reviewed, it's not going to be as valuable. So finding the sweet spot through the design and implementation, and then adjusting the parameters of that as you learn and grow, I would say are extremely important. That helps.
I guess my question was though, if you're just designing it and you're gonna decide that we're just gonna look at 5 officers a year, is that a good criteria? How would you decide if that works?
I'm not, so if one of the metrics you put in place only produced 5 people to look at in a year, are you asking that? Yeah, that's, well, depending on the size of the agency, that might be way too. But I would say that again, that's up to what the data is showing. Is if you have a lot more officers than 5 officers being sustained for misconduct or having sustained uses of force, then 5 is way too few. If you're working I'm working with a smaller department now, and they have just a handful of uses of force, right? 5 might be entirely appropriate for that department. It really depends on the data that's being produced and the expectations and the trends and patterns that are maybe pre-existing or pre-EIS system. Yes.
What do you do with outliers that are positive? So let's say, for example, you're looking at outliers and you have somebody that never uses use of force, and I'm saying that in a positive way. What do you do with outliers?
Yeah, and it was on the slide somewhere and I neglected to read it, but that is another disposition commendation. You will often find great examples, or so than you will find examples that are in need of monitoring or intervention. In fact, I was going to mention on that graph, the dummy graph that I put out. It's just important to commend the squads that are producing great data within your expectations. But there's also a need to evaluate that as well, because we have sort of a bias with data where we automatically assume that low uses of force are better than higher uses of force. And I would say it really depends. There are situations where I've looked at performance data, use of force data, and I question why I'm not seeing more uses of force. So we can take that dummy chart. If I knew that special operation, right, that circumstance that I gave you as a special operation, if I knew that was a search warrant for firearm-related violence, and the search warrant was recovered legally owned or legally used firearms, and I also know that it's associated with at least some stops, if not arrests, I'm questioning why that squad only had 1 use of force report, because I would expect there to be more. Now, maybe, again, there's no good or bad data, but that's going to cause me to review that as well, because low use of force could mean increased officer risk on the street. Some uses of force are designed to prevent more serious uses of force, right? So it really depends on what you're reviewing, how you're reviewing, and also the importance of the ability to easily not only see the data all in one place, but be able to read the use of force report, be able to read that misconduct complaint report within hopefully that same system. What were the results of that? Why is it that I'm seeing this? Is there an issue? So again, no good pieces or bad pieces of data, but if that review says, wow, this officer has been doing a great job. I selected 5 body worn camera footage incidents where I could predict that based on the CAD details, there should have been some type of controversy or conflict or adversarial nature with the community member, and it took their time to explain that that's an officer who is beneficially, proactively limiting their risk to allegations and complaints. And if a supervisor doubles down on that, says, I see what you're doing, thank you, I'm gonna probably throw them in a car with somebody else and use them as a mentor. That might be it. I did want to thank Mr. Clark, who started off the meeting. I agree 100% with his points. Back the 2021 RIPA board report highlighted Phoenix and Seattle as great examples of early intervention systems. And if you do, that caused me to Google search their own individual systems and the issues and the problems they've had. There's been issues and there've been problems. So if anyone says that I have a solution out of the box that's going to work for agency X or agency Y, I really would find that hard to believe. You want to really be careful of it. Again, I'm not recommending any one course of action, but an agency thinking about early warning or early intervention really needs to have a customized value-added approach. Thank you all. I really appreciate the opportunity. My email's in there. Just get a hold of me if something else comes up. Thank you, Brett.
Okay, so that's going to bring us to our agenda number 9, subcommittee reports. And we'll start with the policy and practice. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Policy and practices related to downtown task force and bike unit. I thought I was reading the wrong line there for a second, but Cheryl.
There's nothing new to report. The subcommittee is still together.
Okay. How about the regulations subcommittee?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. Board Member Owens?
Sure.
So do you, from what you've been doing, do you have a sense of how long it's going to take to get to a point where you know more about this, what happened in this so-called scandal, the text messaging of the bike unit?
I don't have a sense of timing, but I'm very aware of we have a limitation to the 240 days. So I don't have a sense of timing as to when we'll finish gathering.
Well, is there something that is holding us back from getting information that you need?
No, I think it's just part of the process of kind of identifying where information, that source of information to come from. I don't think that there's, I'll say a roadblock in front of us that we can think about.
Okay, so is there a roadmap? Is there a roadmap?
No, I wouldn't say there's a roadblock. No, I would say there's. No. I think it's just a kind of a complex investigation due to the allegations that were made. So we're just being very thorough and thoughtful as to how we approach it.
Well, what's the 240 days? When's that? No. And how does that count to the public?
So just to be clear, though, the 240 days is for the misconduct investigation that's taking place parallel to the subcommittees. So because there's some overlap, the approach has been always in here to ensure that there is no information revealed from either investigation publicly while that could impact one or the other. There may be, I can't give you at this moment an exact timeframe, but it is a complex investigation, which any of the complex investigations may be subject to any total provisions. I'm not saying that this particular that there are, but that is also part of the calculation by the investigators. So I don't have the specific end date for you at this moment. But I would say that the subcommittee has gained information that has not been publicly revealed yet. So that there has been some progress made, and we're just again balancing that very delicate line to protect the integrity and respect the integrity of the investigations, especially on the personnel matter of this investigation. But there's, I think, a lot of policy implications that the subcommittee has already identified based on the information and the data that has been obtained to this point. So,
And how can the city council be helped by us? If they're going to be debating or trying to make some decisions and they don't have the input from us because we haven't gotten to the end, and we can't say anything until the end comes, how can we best communicate the importance of waiting until we've concluded this investigation before making a final decision about police chief's election?
yeah, I think that's a very loaded question in the sense that there's again, I'm not trying to be political here or anything at all. There's different elements of how the chief being mentioned on the onset, how that could impact the assessment of the permanent selection. So there are elements of this that I think that the subcommittee can freely discuss with the council members if they reach out. In fact, at least I can test that at least one council member has recently, and I do have communications with the mayor in his office. So in general terms, I do inform him about progress with the subcommittee work. If there are any concerns that council members would want more of a debriefing, they can feel free to contact the office or the chair of the subcommittee, and we can provide a more fuller debrief to prepare them in any decisions that they may or may not make in the upcoming weeks.
Well, maybe I don't know, but I thought that the whole issue of making a permanent appointment was tabled because of this bike patrol text messaging scandal. And so it appeared to me, based on the city council's conduct, the city manager, that the whole issue was waiting for the investigation results before such appointment was to be made. Am I wrong about that?
And I'm not a spokesperson at all for the city manager and the council, but my understanding and recollection of that conversation was that at some point the chiefs at the onset, interim chief Lewis name was mentioned as potentially having some awareness. If that was the element that was holding back on the decision, was the primary element, then that's something that would need to be put on the table again. Well, has that been resolved? So I'm not making any declarations, and now they have a subcommittee about whether we have resolved the involvement of any officers. So that would be something that the city manager I don't know if they have any other information that they're operating under, but it was in general, to my understanding that a selection was not necessarily made at the closed session meeting. But again, I'm not a spokesperson for the city manager or the council.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is based on what the public member has made clear, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. It's a concern to me too. The charter gives us an obligation here that I want to fulfill, which is to give input. I don't know what's happening, and maybe I don't appreciate how much personnel matters are directly involved and therefore confidential. I don't know what's happening. So we can't really make a recommendation of that permanent police chief until we get the final analysis and complete investigative results, it seems to me. So if I were to be asked by city council, well, what do you think? I'd say, well, I think you have to wait until we get the results.
Do we know their investigation? Is the investigation complete?
The independent investigator, it's not my understanding that it's complete.
It's not. Well, I have the same understanding. I was under the same, I was thinking the same thing, that it was going to wait until the investigation was completed, so.
Well, that was the inference when,
Yeah.
when the appointment was withdrawn, or the vote, not the appointment, but the vote to have a permit that was tabled or put until this investigation, which the city was tasked to hire and did, and it's in progress. So that's why I was thrown off when I read about the personnel meeting, closed session of city council. So, well, I've said what I think. I think it should be based on everything I know. I don't know what's happening, but I'd like to know before I can give input, and I assume my fellow board members agree. They can type up if they disagree.
If I may,
Yeah,
in terms of turning that comment into a potential action plan, would you potentially be suggesting perhaps through the subcommittee, the chair can write a letter to the council to inform them that, hey, we're still in the process of this investigation, or is that?
thank you very much. I'll make a motion that the board write a letter to the chair of the subcommittee to say that it's our understanding that that this decision wouldn't be made until there's the final report of the investigation is complete. You can reword the syntax there to make it sound better.
I'll second that motion.
I have a question about, would that come from the chair of the, I believe that needs to come from the chair of the PAB, not the subcommittee.
Well, I'm referred to
It's my understanding that communications from this body don't come from the
Yeah.
subcommittee, but from the.
okay, so I'm.
That's a friendly.
Yes, accept that. And then
Okay,
I do think that's more appropriate.
so there's a motion for the chair to write a letter to council expressing their concerns about this upcoming meeting, which includes the understanding that the appointment was going to wait until the investigations were concluded. Is that accurate? Okay, perfect. So I'll proceed to a roll call vote. Board Member Calavita,
Yes.
Vice Chair Harris,
Yes.
Board Member Leftwich,
Yes.
Board Member Levine,
Yes.
and Board Member Owens. The motion has passed.
And I just have one question for Chair Owens, Chairperson Owens. I know that our last meeting, there was an issue regarding getting data. Has any of that changed since our last meeting for the subcommittee?
I would say that we're not being hindered, with getting information.
Okay,
So we're actually getting information and moving forward.
okay. Okay, so that'll move us to B, Regulation Subcommittee, Board Member Catalina.
I don't have anything to report, except that it's on the agenda for tonight to consider the final draft coming from the subcommittee, and hopefully we will get this off the table tonight. It's been a long haul,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, and then conflict of interest, Board Member Lethbridge.
Yes. So the committee is me and board member Levine and Chair Moore, and we met last week. And what we decided to do is to recommend to the full board that a letter go out from the board asking the city attorney's office for its protocols and procedures regarding the detection and resolution of conflicts of potential conflicts of interest. And so we're going to be meeting again on Thursday, I believe, and we will look at, I'm going to draft the draft. And we will come to agreement hopefully on the substance of that letter, and then would like to have that be on the agenda for our next board meeting. So a vote on the whether or not to send that letter to the city attorney's office.
Can I ask a question? Instead of sending a letter, I'm a kind of anti-letter person. I like to talk, I like to talk to people. So is it possible that, I mean, I understand the need to document what the thoughts are, but is it possible to just have that as an agenda item and have somebody from the city attorney's office kind of sit and talk to us about, you know, I mean, you can put it down on paper so they can review it before they get here, but so we can have a discussion about it versus just firing off a letter.
I think it's very important to be formal about this. We've wrestled with this issue for almost 2 years. And so this would be just kind of a baby step to understand how they detect and resolve conflicts of interest. And so I personally would like to see a document, would like to see something in writing. And if we just met, and we can also meet with them, I'm always happy to meet with them, but whenever we have questions, it takes months to get answers. And I think the subcommittee just preferred to be more formal in the.
I think that's why I'm kind of saying that, because I think when you send that formal letter, just like you said, it takes months to get an answer. Whereas if they're sitting here, I think it's a little easier to kind of tease out more information than at the time.
Presumably, I mean, I'm hoping they have written protocols. And so I would like to see those or know whether they do or not. So,
All right.
I mean, we can do both, but I think we would like to proceed more formally.
I'm thinking both would be a good idea. I mean, we've actually had that meeting or actually it was on Zoom, but we've had those discussions with the city attorney's office before. Remember? We've asked about this before. And in person, so to speak, on Zoom. And it was explained to us that there is no conflict. Et cetera, et cetera.
Right, but I'm not asking, this letter wouldn't be asking about us and whether or not there's conflicts with respect to the PAB. It would be just generally how do you resolve conflicts? How do you, when new matters come in, like the last one, when new matter comes in, you do conflict check and there's a standard procedure.
I see.
So it would be more of a generic request. How does your office handle this? Because I'm sure it happens. It's not just with us. This issue is come up.
Okay, so that'll move us to agenda item number 10, old business. PAB's response to the Public Safety Committee's question regarding unmanned aerial system use.
And if I could start this conversation. So this is the item that we had agendized at our last meeting. The board requested a bit more time to continue reviewing the memorandums and for us to provide a draft memorandum for each of these items. So we have included those items on page 64 and 69. Those were the draft memorandums that we have been voting with. The information we have provided. The fixed camera surveillance system was drafted by board member Calavita. And for the drones, I assisted based on what the office had previously proposed. And I could answer any questions if there are any questions at the moment, or we can walk through these documents depending on what the board needs. Yeah.
So what I want to thank you for all your hard work. I think you did a really impressive job, and it's very helpful. It should be for everybody. So that's absolutely a given. I think I've said this before, but my only remaining question, which I think should be a preliminary, but it could easily be fit in here in this background section, is, first of all, my understanding is that the police department does not have drones. Yeah, is that right? And so this would be the policy, in theory, if we did have drones. Is that correct, too?
So I haven't seen the most recent policy. I would suspect that it also includes what our current use would be. So if we were calling for an agency to come with it, it would outline the use, what that would look like.
And that's exactly what I think isn't clear when I read it. That these two sections don't make it clear that this is a use for what at least our police department does when they seek Albany or county sheriff or whoever the appropriate jurisdiction that does that. Because we can't control how they train their officers in using this equipment, number one. And we can't control when they use it. It gets more complicated to determine, are they flying over Berkeley or Albany or, like that. But we can't really control decision making about use of drones in Berkeley if it's not our drone. And so I think there's a little bit of a disconnect, and I'd like to sort of have a preamble to just clarify, and thank you very much, Lieutenant Tate. You've clarified a lot, but just to know if this should be adjusted to make it more clear that this is only with regard to the question, when do we seek drones used by a department? When do we say, can you get a drone over here? I've got an exigent circumstance, or I have a parade that we'd sort of like to take pictures of, which are two different uses, but the other jurisdiction might have a completely inappropriate way of handling the use that doesn't fit with Berkeley's philosophy, concerns, content in the policy, because we can't control that.
So one thing I might offer is that we have a ban on tear gas, right? So when tear gas, so when other agencies give feedback on whether or not they're going to come to our city, they are guided by our policy. So I would ask that you consider that inference that they're still mandated to follow our policy that we have in place.
What is the control on that mandate? Is that a statutory or is that just a friendly understanding?
That's a really good question.
Because the reason I'm asking is because how do individual officers know what the policy in Berkeley is? If I work for Albany PD and I'm like the guy who's pushing the buttons, how do I know what the policy is that some supervisorial or higher ups might agree, yeah, we're not gonna do this, that, and the other thing.
So when you're talking about a drone, and if say we're doing a building search, and we want to find out a building search, to find out whether or not there are any dangers or people hiding in areas, the drone can go in, absent us having to go and hand check, right? We have to physically put ourselves in danger to walk into a room to find out whether or not there's anyone in there. Whereas the drone can fly in, the operator is doing the same that we might do if it were our drone. And going in and visually clearing that room to say, okay, you guys, this looks good. And so we're not going to sit here for hours and hours and hours and use the PA system to try to call people out. If we can go in and actually see that it appears that there's no threat, maybe this closet is the only area that we can't get into. But I would say that in that sort of circumstance, it's limited for what the drone is doing.
Yeah, but there's always a legal question about the Fourth Amendment search warrant. The drone is authorized under the constraints of our Constitution. And Berkeley might have a higher standard because we have lots of demonstrations and political, activism with a long history here. And so people become concerned and have spoken publicly in our meetings about surveillance and recording images and gathering information with that kind of history in mind. And we might have a more stringent prohibition against the use of drones than Albany, where they don't have the same culture and kind of history of policing in light of kind of community that we have, as our speakers have well pointed out, that each community has very different interests, and so we have perhaps a heightened interest about civil liberties than some others. And I'm not saying good, better, best. I'm just saying it's different. It's a different community. So there's a little there's some lack of clarity. How can we best create a policy that protects our citizens in the way that they expect to be protected?
Seems that having a policy that identifies the exigency and the steps that have to be taken in order to use that type of technology offers that protection. We're not talking about the former that you mentioned of flying a drone to capture all of this data or taking photographs or doing whatnot. We're talking about using it as a piece of safety equipment so that I myself don't physically have to risk my life walking in and clearing this room, whereas this drone can go in and tell me that there's a person hiding behind the door with a gun. That is a very different scenario.
Yeah.
And I think that if we're speaking to that, that would be identified in the policy as a reason that the exigency would check that box for, okay, you can do it.
I completely agree. There are very helpful uses of drones and potentially in safety measures, emergencies, etc. How can we sit down with your department in a collegial way to come up with a policy that kind of crafts protections like this community is asking for? I mean, we've got, I guess your department created some proposals here and we've come back with some suggestions, but
is it possible to sit down? I guess I'm asking you as representative chief to, I would feel a lot better. I'll tell you, just having you here, being able to look at your face and talk to you is so much better than Zoom. And now in a subcommittee, we can talk about how to implement or create a policy that maybe has a higher level of protection and how that can be communicated when we're borrowing drones from other departments to kind of cover some of these concerns. So
I will certainly carry your message and question to
thank you.
leadership.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I had some thoughts about this too, and so on page 65, the end of the second paragraph. Talks about the need to narrow the definition of exigent circumstances. And my position on this is that the definition of exigent circumstances is actually fine. It isn't a definition, it's application of the definition under certain circumstances. And then the need to add something, a prohibition on the use of drones in public places, in public gatherings. And so we mentioned that later, but so I guess my suggestion would be to that last sentence of the second paragraph, if we're working on this letter tonight to try to, I don't know if we are or not, but my suggestion would be not to say the last part of that the definition should be narrowed down, but just to say that the policy should be amended to provide additional safeguards. Because I think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Not changing the definition of exigent circumstances.
Yeah.
I guess my question then is, are we backtracking from that original? Because this memo isn't necessarily designed to essentially give them recommendations. This is more of a response to further questions that we have about. This was written off that original proposal that we had made, which again, if the board decides that's what they can do, we can, but I just want to bring it back to the context of these, this isn't necessarily, how would I put it, in additional, well, it is additional information, but it's more of a response to specific questions based on what we have already provided. In terms of some of the previous topics about, for example, the use of drones in public gatherings, it is a concern that we've already addressed in our original memorandum, and we will address it to a certain extent in this one. During the original meeting where this came up, the department who was starting to do was president of the meeting. He did explicitly note that the prohibition on social gatherings was something that within drafting that original policy that was presented to us was considered. Part of our recommendation here is, again, kind of going back and, this is something we could do in terms of changing the wording for that last sentence as suggested, but part of kind of like the narrowing that exigency, sorry about that, it comes down to, okay, we've taken it out of the policy, but could we explicitly state that drones should not be used for, for example, monitoring public gatherings? And that's to the extent that this, in the context that these, both of these memorandums were proposed. But again, if there's changes that need to be made, we'll make it, because at the end of the day, this is your memorandum. But if we do so, I would suggest that we do it as soon as we can, just because we're essentially, it's coming up, it's going to council. We still don't have a date for the public safety policy committee, see if it's going to come back, so.
That was the question I had was, what was their response to your memo?
We haven't received
Yes,
a response.
We sent the letter, we haven't received the response from the safety committee.
Board Member Owens.
So, when I read through this memo, this is potentially a response from our board to the safety policy committee, and they had two specific questions.
Right.
So I think that we're kind of going in a different direction and not responding to the question. They already have our feedback about the policy, and they had two additional questions
that they wanted to do a little bit more deep dive from the board. So for me, I'd like to stay focused on their questions because they have our feedback from our other memo to them.
Right, so this part about changing the definition is within that response to the question about civil liberties, you know, what are the potential threats to civil liberties? And so this suggests that we need to narrow the definition of exigent circumstances in order to avoid potential threats to civil rights and liberties. I mean, the way this is written, so I guess I would just take out, well, first of all, I don't agree that we need to narrow the definition. So I would just take that out, and then that also on page 66 at the top. It says, as a result of this incident, the PAB has expressed that it is vital to define an exigent circumstance in the context of this policy, as well as specifically prohibit the use of drones, blah, blah, blah. So I would say it's vital to consistently apply the definition of exigent circumstances. Again, I think the definition is fine. It just needs to be applied. And then if we think we need to add the specific prohibition, that's fine. But yeah, the question was, what is the potential threat to civil liberty? So we did get a bit off, I guess, just that, you know, but I didn't answer that.
I should remember. Board member meeting. Okay, thank you. I have board member Lethwich. I think, you know, but in fairness to you, Mr. Morio, this is, you're being batted back and forth. And I think that's. Yeah. You're very generous to be so kind, but and everything you've done is fantastic. So I actually don't think it would be a problem to just eliminate essentially that suggestion if everybody's in agreement. My view is very much the same as board member Lefkowitz, because, you know, this is a frequently litigated issue in criminal cases. What is this exigency? Was this justified? So the courts have defined this very carefully and clearly, and it's pretty rock solid, and we're not going to be able to improve upon it. And frankly, I'm sure lexical policies are similar, because in this case, it's something that actually is very clear and articulate in terms of what it means. So the bottom line is, I think we can answer those questions and make this adjustment if you would be so kind as to indulge some back and forth here that are essentially.
Will we need to have a motion and a vote on that, or is that necessary?
I don't even know, is this such fine tuning, or is this critical?
Yeah, I mean, it's the way that I see it right now, what's being suggested is just a change in word.
Yes.
Section.
Yeah.
I think that the board considers it, or is willing to go for it. We could make that change. And I could connect with both board member Lee and board member Leffish to make sure that that word is correct.
Okay. And there was just one other minor thing that in the second paragraph on page 66 of our packet, the last sentence of that paragraph, taking this into account, blah, 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 the PAB should consider emphasizing. So I think it was that the PAB believes that drones are public, right? Because this isn't a memo.
Would you tell us?
Page 66, the second full paragraph, the last line. This is a memo to the Public Safety Committee and not to us. So I think this is just residual language. The PAB should consider emphasizing.
Yeah.
And it should say the PAB believes that drones. Right.
Okay, yes.
Thank you.
It's not the only place that kind of thing occurs, because it was a mess to us, because.
That I saw.
We need to vote on.
So I'll make a motion that we approve this memo with the proposed changes of 4-member levels.
And I'll second it.
Seconded by Levine.
Okay, so go ahead with your roll call vote. Board Member Calavita,
Yes.
Vice Chair Harris,
Yes.
Board Member Lethledge,
Yes.
Board Member Levine,
Yes.
and Board Member Jones. Passes by unanimous consent. So now we could go to the second memo in this item on page 69.
I don't know if everybody's had a chance to read this memo, but it's, you know, it's in direct response again to, there were 3 questions that the committee asked us. The first was, what's the PAB's stance on how these cameras, this is about the fixed CCTV cameras, and how they might be used for police oversight, and they cited the case of Tyree Nichols in Memphis as, I don't know, I assume everybody saw that video captured by the CCTV. And they had cited that case as possible useful function of those CCTV cameras. And so that was one question. The other question was, how about their use in investigating serious traffic collisions? And the third was how effective does the PAB believe that they are in deterring and reducing crime? And so Jose was very, as usual, very diligent and useful at uncovering the various pieces of research on these questions. And it turns out that the first question on the use of these cameras for police oversight, there really is not any systematic research on that topic, but it was noted in one article that we read that the case of the Memphis killing, that was possible to see because a monitor was able to remotely adjust the angle of the camera to capture it in a really useful way, and that that requires extensive coverage of these. For it to be particularly useful, it would require extensive coverage and monitoring. And I made a note here that that it seems like these would perhaps not be a significant tool beyond what about the BPD's body worn cameras already capture, which have been useful in our reviews of complaints. The second question about traffic collisions, we didn't uncover any research on that topic, and so we said we really can't opine on that at this point. And the third was about.
Before you move, can I just, is it okay if I say something about that second one? First of all, thank you for doing this. This is really helpful. I think it was great. My only thought, and it's on the answer to number 2. And I think I had mentioned this during our retreat when it comes to studies and data that I'm all for it, but there are circumstances where you're proposing a policy or evaluating a policy where there just aren't any studies.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that it's not a good idea,
Right.
even though there isn't data.
Right.
And so it seems to me that they probably would be helpful. And so my only thought, and I don't feel super strongly about this, would be to have the first sentence say, although these cameras could be a helpful investigative tool, comma, the PAB has not at this time, blah, blah, blah. Just to acknowledge that they could be.
Right, so we can add that. I want to direct your attention to the last paragraph of the memo. It does say that that these, have you seen that? That the cameras have been authorized, and if it would happen that there was a collision right underneath one of their cameras, and that would be a benefit. Yeah.
And I assume that these locations we've chosen, and maybe Lieutenant Tate, you can respond that because they have a high incidence of collisions.
And I will tell you, overseeing the traffic bureau, that when we find camera footage of a collision absent any witnesses, it helps it helps everybody. It helps drivers who are saying, no, I have the red light or green light or what have you. So they are immensely helpful to not only us in the investigation, but also the individuals to potentially dispel something that someone is not being.
Good. So let's add that section, that sentence. Jose, did you take note of that?
For section 2.
Yeah,
Section
just
2,
to begin
just
that,
beginning it with, you know,
I'd say, although these cameras could be a helpful investigative tool, comma, and then just go into the next sentence, the PAB has not.
you know, our original, and just to reiterate what we originally said in our response before, I mean, this memo is about these 3 questions.
Yeah.
But originally, our memo was focused primarily on the fact that to note that a use policy where it talked about using these cameras for a variety of purposes was inconsistent with what the council had directed. And so that remains in place, and if council wants to change their direction, then fine, but yeah,
Right.
I think.
And you say
originally-
that in the beginning. I mean, that's,
Yeah. Good, so let's add that to that.
Noted.
And then there is quite a bit of research on the use of, on how effective these cameras are in deterring and reducing crime. And as I mentioned here, and as Jose has found this in his research, there is every study uses a different method with different goals and different types of cameras and different levels of coverage and so forth. So it's very difficult to really pinpoint their utility. However, it does seem to boil down to how extensive the coverage is and whether there's active monitoring. And so what I would say here is, if this is the memo we're going to send to the committee, Jose, if we could simply, your original memo to us had the references at the end, so if you could just import those references.
Yeah.
Here, and you know, so these are just very brief discussions of these policies, I mean, of these studies. And then, you know, the last paragraph basically says that you know, that we noted the inconsistency and that any future proposals to extend camera locations in Berkeley for the purpose of reducing crime be scrutinized within the context of the scant evidence. And of course, that it would be, if these cameras pick up collisions, as Lieutenant Tate mentioned they do, great, but city council needs to be alerted to the fact that their directive is kind of inconsistent, and maybe they want to change that. Frankly, I think it's most important to land something that says, because I can foresee, as we all do, technology is going forward, and they're going to eventually propose, let's add 5 more intersections, let's do 10 more over here, and you know, I think it's good to sort of lay it out that if in the future you're considering that, you need to be aware of what we found here.
Yeah.
Board Member Owens?
I just wanted to ask Board Member California, what's the difference between your memo and the memo that was drafted from
Jose?
Yeah.
I tried to, my feeling is that Jose's was very long, and I extracted it and tried to emphasize the main points. And, you know, I read through the research myself and also added something here and there, but mostly this is kind of like an abstract of his original memo. but I wanted to hit the main points because, and make it a little briefer, because I don't think people read long.
So,
I mean, some of it was, Jose's was very, some parts of it were kind of research nerdy, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
But most people wouldn't understand it. He pointed me to where to look for the research, that was really helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, is there any further discussion on this issue? Okay, so we'll move to new business.
Well, I mean, I know that we find this, I need to resend a version of this with the change that board member Lethbridge mentioned and the list of references at the end.
One second, then.
Sorry, who's the second?
Me.
Okay.
What was, remind me, what were your changes?
It was just,
Under number 2, to mention that while there's a lot of research, they could be helpful in collision investigation.
That's it.
So go ahead with the roll call vote. Board member Calavita,
Yes.
Vice Chair Harris.
Yes.
Board member Lethbridge.
yes,
Board member Levine.
Yes.
And board member Owens.
Yes.
And passes by unanimous consent.
Now we move to number 11, our new business. Review of the PAB's proposed permanent regulations. Alavita,
So this begins on page 73 and again, we say for this chart, that's going to direct you to the changes that have been made since you last saw this document. The changes are in response to advice from the city attorney's office. And most of the changes are simply to add reference to MOUs or the charter, you know, the exact charter section and so forth. But if we want to just begin at the beginning, I can sort of navigate you through it. On page 73, the only revision that you'll see here has to do with the effect of a violation of confidentiality by a board member.
excuse me, board member Kelly, I'm
yeah.
just wondering if we need to, it seems like it could take us a very long time.
It's not going to take long, I swear. I mean, because there's only about 4 places.
Okay.
The rest are all references. Board member Lethbridge. No, I swear. I swear, no one's gonna be really, okay, because they're not, okay. We're adding weight, they're not waiting. This first thing is just that instead of saying that we are going to disqualify a board member who violates confidentiality, the city attorney pointed out that we don't have the authority to do that, and the person needs to self-recuse. That's all. I'm just finding the ones that are. Okay, if you turn to page 76. Number 5. This just adds in cases of request for documents. It adds the time frame that these documents need to come from the police department, as this is verbatim from the city charter. So we just added this here to make that especially clear. And there is one okay, so on page 78. This is about when a hearing will be convened. When we receive the findings and recommendations from the office, from the director and the investigator. This is when a hearing will be convened. And there's two circumstances, two primary circumstances that we've tried to make very clear in this section. One is if the board and the director agree that any of the allegations will be sustained, that we will have a hearing.
At the election of the subject officer.
At the election of the subject officer, the subject officer can say, no, I don't need it, don't want it. But if the subject officer elects, we will have a hearing if something's going to be sustained. And the other circumstance is if the board decides that further fact finding is necessary, that a hearing would be useful in achieving. And that might be in a case of an allegation being not sustained, not exonerated or unfounded, but not sustained, which means that there wasn't sufficient evidence on one side or the other. If the board decides in those cases that further fact finding would be useful, then we'd have a hearing.
In this document, aren't B and C, isn't that, I mean, I kept reading that, this is saying the same thing, but then I see that B talks about the hearing may be convened on all allegations in the complaint, and those words aren't in C, but is this a typo or are these different things and I'm missing what?
I think this was, if I recall correctly, the section where there was a brief conversation about whether we should combine them or not.
Aren't B and C saying the same thing, except that one says on all allegations in the complaint?
It is the same thing, except for that.
No, they're not quite saying the same thing. B says if the board and director agree and none of the findings are sustained.
No, I'm talking about B in the
B and
second
C.
column
Oh, I'm sorry.
on page 70.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of them says that if the board can request that the staff go back and do additional investigation. The other one says the board can request the hearing occur. So it's two different things. What it says, board.
Maybe I'm misreading it. B and C look to me like they're saying the same.
It says the
thing,
board may
except-
request that the staff conduct
Further
further investigation as
B
needed.
says that we send it back to the staff to do more investigation. C says we do a hearing.
Doesn't,
So it's two different.
But it also
No, it
says the
says
board may request.
investigation too. Yeah, it's the same thing with the exception of that one sentence.
So I don't know, if this is just for internal purposes, it doesn't
Yeah, I
matter. If
see.
this is something that's going out, you might just take another look because I think that's duplicative, but we don't need to spend much time on it. Yeah.
Do you see what she's talking about?
Yeah,
I think it was just a
might just be a thing.
typo. Sorry about that. Okay. Most of these are adding sections from the charter references. So on page 81 at the very bottom, this is a minor thing, but you might be interested. It talks about viewing body worn camera footage at the hearing. And relevant body worn camera footage may also been shown during the hearing. And the sentence, it stops there, but we added at the discretion of the hearing panel. In other words, the hearing panel will decide. And then the last thing, which is important, is on page 84. This is really very much at the end of the document. And you may remember that we talked about anonymous and or confidential filings. And it was pointed out to us that we can have anonymous filings, but we cannot have confidential. Anonymous meaning unknown to everybody. In other words, it's not signed. Confidential means the office and the hearing panel may know who it is, but it will remain confidential to the police department and so forth. It was pointed out that it can't be confidential because once that form is signed, that whole hearing packet goes to the subject officer, et cetera, et cetera. So we removed the part about confidentiality, kept the part about anonymity. Okay, so that's pretty much it.
So I'll make a motion that we move the regulations forward to whatever the next step is. I don't know if it goes back to the city attorney's office. I don't know what happens with it. But whatever that next step is,
We're gonna pass it.
with the changes that or that were left.
Right, okay, this is just an internal document, right, so we don't.
Yeah.
So just making sure that.
Right,
We'll review the document for like any typos or anything, I'm gonna kind of have a bit of a break from not looking at it. Just to make sure it's clean, okay?
And so what would be the next steps?
Send it back to the city attorney, it will be the meeting control process. We handle also with the assistance of the negotiator that's hired by the city for this. And then it would go to council for approval.
The negotiator, so the city will hire a negotiator.
They have
Will
already,
you confer?
yeah, correct.
Okay.
Could I just raise one more tiny thing, let's say, on page 96? And then, thank you all, whoever did the pagination, it makes it so much easier to navigate the packet.
yeah.
On page 96, number 7. I think it needs to say conduct of interviews and exercise of constitutional rights.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
Yeah, these
and
are.
that was the only typo that I
Little
found,
typos
but,
are what
you know,
were.
yeah,
Okay,
that's it.
so thanks for flagging that.
so
Okay,
was the motion,
I move that we accept this draft of permanent regulations and pass it on to city council.
I think there was already.
I think that board member Owens already
Oh,
made
did
the
you?
motion, we just
I'm
need a
sorry,
second.
was it seconded? I'll second.
No, it's seconded, yeah.
All right. So I'll go ahead with the roll call vote, board member Calavita,
Yes.
vice chair Harris,
Yes.
board member Lovett,
yes,
board member Green,
Yes.
and board member Owens.
Yes.
All right.
we need to break out the
We really
champagne.
should.
man.
Yeah.
Okay, so we could move on from that item.
Okay, so item B, review of the BPD's 2022 annual report on police equipment and safety and community safety ordinance.
Vice Chair, may I ask a question of the director? When we used to meet in this building, there was a closeout time, like, are they gonna throw us out at what time?
I believe they said, 9, was it 9 or 9:30?
It was.
9 to 12.
There's,
Closer to 10.
yeah,
But they understood that it'd be fine.
Because the person, there's always someone who has to close off and they don't want this to stay forever.
yeah,
Yeah.
there was, we we did ask about that because we were concerned about this particular meeting. When we spoke to the representative here, they indicated between 9:30 and 10, but also that if we do anticipate, needing to stay for that long, we can have a conversation with the monitor and see if they need us out by a particular time. I can check right now if you'd like me to.
No, I was just wondering what conversations you had.
Yeah, we were mindful of that for this particular meeting, so.
And is this item 11B, is this something, I don't see the Chair Lawrence, his name's on it, he's not here, is this
Yeah.
something that's time
He-
sensitive?
Yes, it is time sensitive, but he was out of there just because he was a member of the subcommittee. But we had already discussed that staff was going to
Okay,
essentially guide it and bring it back to the board just because of the workload that everyone. Mhm.
So, but it is interesting, just making a note about the time sensitivity, the way that the ordinance reads, it says that within 60 days of the police department submitting an annual report, the police accountability board shall place a report on an agenda item for an open session of the regular meeting. So we're within that 60-day period. Doesn't specifically say that you need to make a decision today, but that's what we want to make sure it's on the agenda within that 60-day period.
Is there someone else that was on that committee?
Not present, but the way that we treated this, we had a sort of an agreement of a delegation for us to take the first stab at it, and then we'll present it back to you. So
Okay.
there was actually no other members on that subcommittee.
Previously, it was, Mizell and, you know.
Okay.
I'm a little stretched there. so.
Yeah, yeah.
But staff has supplied us with a draft proposal or something, so I think we just focus on the draft proposal.
Page 136.
One forty-two.
Sorry,
142. Oh,
Sorry, no, yes.
One forty-two.
So what 142 is essentially a draft version that we prepared ahead of time, similar as we did with the other policies. 136 is more of our initial review and stuff.
So which one should we be looking at?
but 142 is what we're on board.
I thought it was a really good document, but I had on page 145. Because the chart shows that the requirement is complied with in all aspects except the geographical breakdown, which is on page 145. And it says that the PAB believes that only 2 of the 3 requirements outlined in this section have been sufficiently met, with the 3rd requirement needing minor changes. But it wasn't clear to me what those 2 were and what the 3rd was.
Yeah, sorry. So what the third one here was the usage of the percentages. There is data included about particularly when control equipment was used on the basis of a warrant, but it's just more of a listed out. It's listed out as there's 5, which I think for some purposes it's fine, but because the BMC explicitly asked for percentages, that's what we flagged. And that's why we noted it's a bit of a minor change. It's a light lift.
But what are the 2 of the 3 that were? I thought it would be helpful if you just mentioned.
The reporting days and instances, so this is in terms of the actual report, it's page. Starting on page 121 to. What was it,
But for clarity,
132.
maybe you could have a parens there, just indicating what those 2 are.
Okay, yeah, no.
Well, it does say on page 146, it says currently the BPD provides a calendar releases specific to the piece of equipment and the beep in which they put in the use. So that's the 2, right? And then the 3rd, to get compliance, is just the percentage. Am I reading that right?
Yes.
Is that what it said? I think it's there.
No, I thought that what that was saying was they counted them, but they didn't provide a percentage.
True. And so the count is one of the things they provided. The beep where it was used was the other thing they provided. The only thing they didn't provide is the percent.
Is that?
And then I get the geographical.
Yeah, I think that's.
I didn't read it right.
And if it's a clarity issue, we could definitely go back and reword that. But yeah, so the geographical breakdown is included. Again, the reporting days and instances of use, those are the summaries that are provided. And the authorized usage percentage, again, there's numbers provided, but it's the percentage breakdown.
So also there was just a grammatical thing to ensure compliance, that top of page 146, to ensure compliance, the PAB asks that the BPD record the percentages. Ask that they record, not reports. So that was a very good document, actually.
I just want for your situational awareness, just a caveat, the BMC is little bit limited in terms of the board's ability to do a thorough assessment, even. The VNC is asking, the board to review whether each piece of equipment was complied with based on the report. If you looked at the report, at face value, you can say that the conditions, for each particular event was met. I would, in future reports for this, I would ask the board to consider or have a discussion about doing a more thorough qualitative review, because our memo here is limited to the contents and the reported requirements of the report, the annual report as a whole. But for us to, and I don't think for the board even, to be in a position to determine, based on this short summary description, whether each equipment was used appropriately, I don't know that that can be done responsibly. I think you will need to be able to look at the incident report, the body worn camera footage in where available. So that would just be for future reports, my recommendation, in order for the board to be positioned to say, yes, this equipment was used under this circumstance appropriately, you really need to go beyond this summary.
Yeah,
So that's just for something to.
yeah, that's for the day that we're not pressed for time.
Yeah, yeah,
That's when we get that data.
right. Yeah.
That's a joke. I moved
Okay,
that
so,
we,
I didn't ask if there was a motion.
that we, accept this, draft with those new little changes.
And I'll second it.
I think we're in board member left with first. Let me just get back to my roll call sheet. Board member Calavita,
Yes.
Vice Chair Harris.
Yes.
Board member Leftwich,
Yes.
Board member Levine,
Yes.
and Board member Rhodes.
Yes.
All right, passed by unanimous consent. All right.
Okay, next, we're back.
Okay.
Public comment. One.
Okay.
We're still,
I'm still here. I just, my legs are numb. I cannot. First, thank you for the motion that you passed and the letter that you decided to write. But I think I'm gonna ask you for a little bit more. Well, 3 hours or so. I fished in the notes, and the only meaningful notes about the participation, the subcommittee for the search for police chief. The only meaningful note, and this is minutes from the meeting sometime in October of last year. Says that participated, 3 candidates interviewed, positive experience. Concerns remain about the PAB role in the process. And the conclusion of this very brief paragraph is that decision works with city manager, but showed intent to consider PAB suggestions.
Can you repeat your last sentence, please?
That's the conclusion of this very brief paragraph, was that the decision rests with the city manager. And that she showed intent to consider PAB's suggestion. So from all the brouhaha of creating this board, replacing the old body, etc., this paragraph with these very weak and weak meaning language is all that stays to say the public has had some meaningful voice in the selection of its next police chief. So it seems like in this political world that we live in, the Police Accountability Board also have to provide oversight upstream to the city council. It's not only downstream, because our city council members and the mayor were all kind of, summer 2020, everybody was on board saying the right things, but when the rubber hits the road, here they are, sneaky little meeting. I'll take it back. Scheduling a meeting in a very short notice that doesn't even allow you the time to update your agenda. So you're sticking by the protocol And they just sniped that meeting. The agenda item of the selection of the police chief was scheduled for sometime in November, I think, or something like that. Somehow it happened that the same week, the whole task force scandal showed up, so it was delayed. That was supposed to be under consent calendar. Consent calendar. Oh, this is just a matter of routine. We'll put it on consent calendar. Well, luckily, they pushed it back. I'm asking you to pull all the punch that the spirit of this board has beyond the decorum and the protocol, etc. So there's two tiers to the issue of selection. One, was the process right? Was the process one that actually this body had a voice in the public had a voice? According to what I'm reading in the minutes, even the subcommittee had doubts of what's the process, what's their jurisdiction, etc. So they made suggestions, 3 people were interviewed, city manager will decide. Close to 0, I would call it. The other tier is the tier that has to do with the specifics of the incidents that led to the delay of this confirmation. 2 tiers. And I believe your letter, you mentioned basically addressing the second. In light of what city council said, that they're going to postpone the confirmation until all this resolved. Yes, they definitely have to stick to that. Because it seemed like all of you understood that, and I understood that too, because I was in the city council meeting too. But second tier, and maybe the more important one, is whether this board had the right voice, whether the public had the right voice in selecting, was this a proper process? To me, there's like, I just, again, a lot of time, I Googled 17,000 police departments, plenty of lieutenants and ex-chiefs and other people, 3 candidates interviewed. And that concludes our process for the person who's supposed to take us to the promised land of reimagined policing. I can't see it, so I'm asking you to write a strong letter, and remember, it needs to arrive by city council tomorrow because their meeting is on Thursday. So thank you, I appreciate you listening.
Is there any?
So I ask you to have another motion and put some more punch behind that letter that you just discussed. I mean, why is this body here if not for this? Thank you.
Is there any additional public?
My name is Kit Sagador. First, I want to apologize for having paced and stood and so forth. I'm having some physical problems. I really couldn't sit still through the meeting, but I really appreciate you coming to the meeting. Also, I sort of that, I guess, maybe in the future I need to do it on Zoom. That would be better. I have hearing difficulties, and I am actually headed towards getting a hearing aid, but that takes time. And there were some parts of the meeting where I really couldn't hear what was being said. So in terms of my being able to actually, be a member of the public hearing the meeting, I'm sorry, there were times where I really don't know what was said. But I do believe that one item which you have now already concluded, which is the regulations. I do want to draw your attention back to that section, and here it's on bottom of page 98 to the top of page 99, where I really think the regulations don't quite cover everything. So that, for instance, on bottom page 99, if the board affirms the proposal of sustained finding or recommendation of discipline on any allegation upon the election of the subject officer, a confidential complaint hearing may be convened. So it doesn't say what happens if the subject officer does not make that election. I think what would happen is that the decision would be made without a hearing, but that's not spelled out. And I really think it would be clearer if it spelled out, if it spelled that out. But otherwise, if the officer does not elect, then it will go, the decision is made without the hearing. And I think that would be clearer if that was spelled out. Then at the top of page 99, I don't think the clause B and clause C, I believe they really are the same thing. They were just phrased a little differently. right? And you talked about that a little bit, but I couldn't hear what you were saying, so I don't know what conclusion you came to on that one. But for each of those, again, it doesn't specify, well, what happens if further investigation would exceed the 120-day time? That isn't spelled out. So I don't know what would happen. If the board felt that further fact finding was warranted, but you're out of time, then what? And I just don't like to see holes left in documents. And so I'm hoping that those will not be put forward with holes. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. I know this was a long meeting. A lot was covered. We all got more tired. My ears got more tired. And I really appreciate your work. Thank you all.
And thank you for your help on
Thank
the
you.
subcommittee.
Yeah.
The acoustics in this room are terrible.
Yeah, well, you know,
I don't
there's this,
know. Yeah, but the room itself, we all need
band
to
here
look at the
going on,
shelves.
which doesn't help. But yeah, and I don't know why everybody, including you, were given these very uncomfortable chairs and a whole row of really much more comfortable chairs. Why not this sound?
I think we should all have bullhorns or something.
We should have mics on the tables.
All right.
We should.
So we do have one more speaker who's joining us virtually. I'll allow them the permission to speak. Okay, Charles Clark, you should have permission to speak.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair and Mr. Director. I am Charles Clark, and I found Deputy Chief Bolton's presentation about early intervention systems very interesting. What I took away from that was that it's the age-old saying that what gets measured gets managed. And unfortunately, in this age we live in, employees who are subjected to management systems that are measuring things are not viewing it as beneficial. They are viewing it as punitive. And I gather that the $100,000 that the council would have approved on the consent calendar tonight is designed to be beneficial, at least it says it is. But I fear that it will be interpreted punitively. That's just the way things seem to work out in these things. There were a few good observations there. One of the important things that this board should continue to consider is, what does the city of Berkeley want to achieve with this early intervention system? The motivating feature of its being promoted is to really monitor and eliminate racial disparities in police conduct. And, you know, back in the days of the fair and impartial policing, and even in the reimagining public safety task force, there was always this statement about, we need more data. Well, we now have data. The RIPA data that the department delivered well in advance of the statutory deadline and has now amassed over the last 2 years has given us some insight into the sorts of activities that our police actually conduct. So we find that Berkeley's police do not oversample blacks versus whites. There's this issue about finding weapons on both groups at about the same rate, except for firearms, which are found in a drastically higher rate on black persons stopped than on white persons stopped. So, if we're looking for biases, we should really understand what are the biases we're trying to eliminate, and how is the department misbehaving if that's the standard that we're adopting. It's funny, there was talk about a machine language algorithms. Well, one of the things we're learning about those is that how you train those systems determines the result you'll get. Now, I told you that this department has had 36 bullets fired in service over the last 22 years. It happens that the last 8 bullets fired in the last 11 years were all by female officers. Now, if we train our machine language system improperly, we might draw the very wrong conclusions that our female officers are trigger happy. which is not true. Again, it's, you know, one of those things where you should really think about what you're trying to do with these systems before you go off and do them. As far as the police chief search is concerned, remember the language written in the city charter that 83% of Berkeley's citizens voted for, including myself, I might add. It says, the city manager shall consult the Police Accountability Board on evaluation of candidates for chief. Now, that does not amount to a veto. At least I can't see that language in there. And I have really seen over the last few months a lot of ruffled feathers about the degree of consultation or lack thereof by the city manager. That should be mentioned and it should be fixed. But I don't know that it actually reflects on what should be done with the nomination of this particular chief of police. You've had 2 years to observe how she does. I've already said, you know, before the city council that I endorse her being confirmed for the permanent position. But if you have a problem with this chief, then you should put that down in writing, because I think that would be very useful to all the parties concerned. Anyway, until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, at this time, are there any additional members of the public who would like to provide public comment virtually? This is the last call. Okay, with that, we have no additional public comment.
Okay, so that'll move us to closed session. Are we staying in this one? Are we staying?
Depends on the members of the public.
For the members of the public joining us virtually, we will pause the recording. And we will temporarily block folks off while we conclude the closed session.
Okay, so we are back in session and we have decided to administratively close complaints number 27, 28, and 30. I think the motion that we adjourned.
Second.
Good night, everyone.